This video is brought to you by our new show, The Daily Briefing. That's the show where we go through the 5 most important news stories each day, giving you a rundown of everything you need to know around the world in a matter of minutes. Watch on the separate TLDR Daily YouTube channel or listen by searching in your favourite podcast app. As you probably already know, the UK government has committed to net zero by 2050. That's a reasonably ambitious target, so there'll need to be some similarly large changes in the next few years in order to make this a reality. For example, there needs to be a complete overhaul of the tax system to account for the rise of electric vehicles, something we recently discussed in the Daily Briefing. But there'd also need to be a huge move towards more renewable electricity. However, detractors argue that these changes would push costs up for consumers. One such detractor, Nigel Farage, has therefore insisted that it's only fair to hold a referendum on net zero to decide whether we, as a country, should push forward with our net zero ambitions. So let's take a look at whether a referendum could be held on the issue and what the arguments are. Environmentalism and green issues have been rising in prominence around the world in recent years, and Britain's certainly no exception. In fact, even Johnson's Conservative Party agree that more needs to be done to tackle this issue, with his government implementing a net zero target for 2050, essentially committing that the country's greenhouse gas emissions will be net zero in the next 30 years. That doesn't mean that there won't be any emissions by 2050, although cuts will inevitably be made. But it does mean that remaining emissions will be offset by programs which remove greenhouse gas emissions from the atmosphere. Now, the UK isn't alone in this effect, and it's not even the most ambitious. Other countries like Sweden and Germany have set sooner targets, but the UK is part of a large group pushing for net zero emissions by 2050. While the left and centre-right might be in agreement on this target for the UK, not everyone is on board. And in early March, Nigel Farage announced that he'd be pushing for another major referendum, this time on the issue of net zero. And he'll be driving this issue through his new campaign group, Vote Power, Not Poverty. It seems then from the title alone that he's trying to capitalise on the recent increase in energy prices to argue that net zero policies generally inflict harm on the average person. In fact, in a Daily Mail article arguing his current position, Farage says that politicians in Westminster had taken the country down a ruinous path through their commitment to net zero. Farage and his people expand on this argument through their website, with them claiming that the target will do nothing to deliver any meaningful benefit to the global environment, but will destroy British jobs and lead to massive increases in energy bills year on year, saying that the target is net stupid. Now, clearly a lot of arguments are being made here, so let's run through a few of the different points. Firstly, let's consider the argument that net zero will provide no meaningful benefit to the global environment. To grasp this, we need to understand why net zero became such a major target in the first place. In 2015, 192 member states signed the Paris Agreement, which committed to limiting global temperature increases to a 1.5 degrees Celsius average temperature rise from pre-industrial times. The reason for this is that it's been shown that a higher temperature rise would lead to more extreme weather events, which would negatively impact the environment, humans, and other members of the animal kingdom. Missing this target then could lead to droughts, a reduction in food availability, and an increased risk to small islands and low-lying areas. So, as we see it, it's in everyone's interest to keep average temperature rises below 1.5 degrees Celsius, which is exactly why 192 member states signed the agreement committing themselves to it. Actually sticking to this target, though, is more difficult than making a commitment. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change claims that just 510 gigatons of CO2 can be released between now and 2050 if we want to stick to the plan, and achieving emissions that low could be difficult. Existing and planned fossil fuel infrastructure is expected to release 850 gigatons of CO2 in that time. So there's a clear need to reduce carbon emissions. Now, looking domestically, an argument could be made that the UK contributes very little to global emissions, and there is some truth to this. For example, on CO2, the UK was the 18th most polluting country in the world in 2017 and 2020. 18th is still pretty high on the list though, when you're considering 196 countries globally. Now, granted, the UK also isn't at the top of the list when it comes to CO2 emissions per capita. For example, in 2020, the UK released 4.85 tonnes of CO2 per person, compared to the US's 14.24 and Russia's 10.81. Therefore, these numbers may be co-opted by Farage's anti-net zero types to try and argue that the UK shouldn't need to try and hit net zero. However, there are clear counter-arguments to this case. As we already hinted at, the UK isn't actually that low down on the list. 18th globally on carbon emissions is something to work on, as are our per capita CO2 emissions. We also can't really expect larger countries to reduce their emissions if we're doing nothing to address our own. Larger countries and larger emitters just won't agree to reduce their own emissions without other countries pitching in too. After all, can we expect nations like India, who have very small GDP per capitas, to pick up the slack? Especially considering that the UK has emitted so much carbon historically. So the argument goes that we need to support them and do our bit too, especially if we're going to expect others to cut down. However, that's not where the argument with Farage and his Vote Power Not Poverty group ends, with them likely trying to make the case that to achieve net zero will end up hurting individuals. For example, on their website, it's argued that net zero will destroy British jobs while making us poorer and colder. It's obviously hard to know for sure whether trying to get to net zero will cost households more, but the evidence so far points towards no. The UK government has already demonstrated that they intend to try and make things cheaper for individuals. The UK government has waived its vehicle tax on electric vehicles, which is why electric vehicles have virtually no running costs compared to traditional combustion engine vehicles. Additionally, the IPCC report, which was published last week, demonstrates that the cost of items used to reduce emissions have actually dropped significantly in the last couple of decades. As this chart shows, solar panels, batteries, and electric vehicles have all dropped in price significantly. The point is here that there are reasons to be optimistic, and it can't be guaranteed that committing to net zero will actually end up making things more expensive. Nonetheless, even if Farage has got a base of people he could campaign to, it's insanely unlikely that a referendum on this issue would end up being called. Now, people did say a similar thing about the EU referendum, but that was different in a number of ways. Firstly, referendums are usually reserved to solve constitutional issues. The EU was a constitutional issue for the UK because a lot of our laws derive from EU ones. But that's just not true of net zero. In fact, when there was a petition calling for a referendum on the topic, the government rejected it, saying that national referendums are a mechanism to endorse major constitutional change. Debates about national policy are best determined through parliamentary democracy and the holding of elections. The second reason a referendum looks unlikely is that there are numerous establishment politicians who are sympathetic to the cause. And thirdly, the Brexit issue had been allowed to slowly gain momentum over multiple decades leading up to the eventual referendum. It's also important to remember that the establishment is probably scarred after Brexit, and as referendums can only be called by the government, you'd need them to agree to it. Cameron was clearly overconfident about the chances of Remain's victory in 2016, so it's unlikely that any Prime Minister, Johnson included, would take such a risk again. So with this in mind, it just looks unlikely that Farage will get his way and get the net zero referendum that he so desires. However, if you want to be updated on this story, how the UK and others are addressing climate change, then be sure to check out the Daily Briefing. That's our new daily show where we explain 5 news stories every single day. We pick out the big stories, the ones you ought to know about, but we also choose some smaller ones that you might otherwise miss. So if you want to be better informed about the world around you and news from all over the globe, then you really ought to subscribe. And it's only a few minutes each day, so what do you have to lose? We post a video version every weekday over on the TLDR Daily channel, so you can subscribe over there. Or you can listen along to the podcast by searching for the TLDR Daily Briefing in your favourite podcast app. Thanks for your support, and I hope you enjoy the new show.